Well, welcome to Ask RMI. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kelly Vaughn, Marketing Director for Rocky Mountain Institute. And today we're talking about commercial buildings. So commercial buildings are important because they use about 39% of all electricity in the U.S. and half of all commercial buildings are leased. So from RMI's perspective and the industry's perspective, if we're ever going to take a bite out of the climate impact of our buildings, we need to tackle leased commercial space. So today I am joined by Cara Carmichael and Blair and we are going to be putting these two quite literally on the hot seat to talk about net zero energy commercial buildings, why they make sense, make money, and are critical for tackling in order to solve our climate challenge. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And first, a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to engage in about a 20-minute discussion. I'll be moderating between the two of them. And then we are going to hand it over to you, our viewers, to pose questions just using the chat box. And we'll get to as many as we can. And if we don't get to your question, we'll be sure to answer those immediately afterwards. So thanks in advance for submitting your great questions. And first, before we get started, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your role in the building sector. I'll start with you, Blair.
So I'm the CEO of John Madden Company, and we came to Greenwood Village, so southeast Denver, in the 1960s. And we pioneered that whole master development plan and integrating art into everything that we do, and we build and manage all of our buildings. So now, in the future moving forward, my role is to further that pioneering spirit with integrating sustainability into all of our developments and really creating a place where people can thrive. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
Literally boots on the ground, leading the charge.
Yes.
And Cara, how about you?
I've been at RMI for 13 years, and I have a design and an engineering background, and my passion really is bringing buildings to a new standard and helping more buildings of different typologies get to net zero energy and demonstrating the financial case behind that and the value that it provides not only to owners but also to occupants.
Wonderful. And so when we talk about net zero energy, first off, a definition. Net zero is defined as a building that generates as much clean energy on site as it consumes in any given year. So when we think about that and all of the value it can theoretically provide, why aren't net zero commercial leased buildings more mainstream? Why are they still sort of leading edge instead of truly mainstream?
I think it's just a lack of knowledge. I think you get into a groove, you're a developer, you have your model. So it's just a matter of shifting, or a paradigm shift, so to speak, in how you think about your developing your building. So I really just think it's an educational piece. I think the market is ready for it, been ready for it for a long time, but now the information is there, the mainstream is ready. Yeah. So
the buildings industry it's notoriously an industry of followers, so nobody wants to go first. Nobody wants to take that risk. And people have gone first. It's been done. There's validation behind the business case and the best practices around how to approach it and how to do it most effectively. And so I totally agree with Blair that a large part of it is just education and breaking the norm on traditional models. I think it's also about setting goals and starting early. I think a lot of people come into a development not really sure what the end goals are, and then halfway through design they kind of pick their heads up and say, oh my gosh, let's make this a leading edge demonstration project. I want it to be net zero energy. And at that point it'll cost more to get there, and it's it incorporates more design challenges, and we saw this on a project that Blair and I worked together on. And so I think it's about having that vision early, and if you can bring the team together and align stakeholders around that goal from the onset, cost premium and the value that you're going to get out of it long term is going to be much better.
Right. Significantly goes down. Yeah.
Maybe even taking another step back, why do net zero commercial buildings matter at all? I talked a little bit in the introduction about energy savings and carbon savings, but why should we care?
I care, I guess personally. 2017 was one of the 2 hottest years on record. And so climate change is happening. And as Kelly mentioned, buildings are the single largest contributor to climate change. I mean, the building industry emits more carbon in itself than, transportation and industry, the other 2 kind of following industries. And so if we can't get our heads around how to build better and how to operate our buildings better, that's ultimately better for us as people in it, then, we're cutting ourselves short on the opportunity to increase our own individual productivity, but also we're not going to achieve the climate goals that we need to sustain long into the future.
And why not? I mean, you think about, some of the larger tenants that are coming online, and they're really caring about the workspace for their employees. And, Fidelity came to our campus, and it was a requirement for us to recommission our buildings to LEED certification. So we had to go through the entire recommissioning process just to provide a space for their employees to thrive in. Companies are really caring about this now. And so I think from a tenant perspective and a leasing perspective, it's becoming more and more important.
So what I'm hearing is it's truly necessary for a competitive advantage, especially as lease space is becoming more and more in demand, especially in this Colorado real estate market.
Yeah.
So maybe tell me a little bit more about some of the additional sources of value that net zero energy can provide beyond energy and this competitive advantage. And I'll start with you, Cara.
So I think one commonly cited metric is this 330-300 rule, where from an organizational perspective, $3 of your operating costs, 3x of your operating costs are spent on utilities, energy bills. 30x is spent on rent, that's your physical space. 300x is spent on your people, $300. So, while as an engineer and an architect, I love making buildings as good as they can be to save energy and save money. But really the bigger cost driver is in your people. Mm-hmm. So if you can build spaces that make occupants happier, healthier, and just even fractionally more productive, that's going to totally outweigh any energy savings that you can achieve. So I think it's about striking that balance, and really you can have net zero energy buildings that, yes, everybody, there's no heating and cooling, everybody walks around in sweaters and free, but this new paradigm shift in the industry around valuing how occupants feel, that's driving this improvement in our building thermal comfort, a greater focus on it, and it's really pushing towards net zero energy buildings that are fundamentally more comfortable for our people.
And we have an existing campus, so we have existing buildings. Our older building is about 20 years old, and our newer building is close to 10 this year. And so the net zero component, obviously I'd love to develop all our future buildings net zero, we will. But in transitioning our campus towards net zero, it's a process, right? It's, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take at least 20 years. And but starting somewhere is what's important to us. And so starting with taking care of our tenants and taking care of our campus, et cetera. And I know we're going to get more into that later, but that's important to us.
Yeah, I mean, so say I'm not convinced that net zero energy is the way to go, and I think developers may be more willing to point to the barriers in what is the reason for not pursuing net zero, as opposed to the benefits and the value add of taking it on. From your perspective, what have been the biggest barriers that you've been required to overcome in your own pursuit of net zero?
So I think the idea of cost, right? If we think about pure cost and offsetting energy and where we're going to put solar, or where we put, or even off campus, or there are a lot of, because we have existing buildings, right? So cost. However, we've just completed, we've been approved for PACE financing. And so one of the biggest concerns with our older buildings are the energy systems and the drag on energy and the costs involved with that. Well, we're replacing all of those to more highly efficient energy systems, and through CPACE, which was, and those of you who don't know about CPACE, it's an excellent way to diversify your capital stack, so all of the capital improvements aren't on the owner, and it's just an amazing way, and it's very simple once all parties involved get their heads wrapped around it to make happen. I don't know why anyone wouldn't take advantage, and I think they will start taking advantage of it. So it's a great first step, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And you just completed the largest CPACE project to date in Colorado, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, so that worked, like the strength of CPACE is it enables like existing buildings, which is the bulk of our building stock, to undertake upgrades and have that cost rolled into our tax assessment. So it's not burdening landlords for additional capital costs to improve their buildings. It's actually rolling it into the tax structure, and that easily can be passed through to tenants.
Right, and so the increase in costs is one thing, but the energy savings offsets that increase in energy costs.
Mm-hmm.
So, and McKinstry was a big part, as well as Rocky Mountain Institute, in helping us define what those energy savings will be. So, it takes a team.
And just for all of those who aren't familiar with PACE, CPACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy, and there is PACE programs in residential, and then there's PACE programs for commercial buildings. So congratulations on that big win.
Thank you.
But I would maybe ask about these leased buildings in particular. So we're sitting here at the moment in Boulder Commons. RMI is an anchor tenant in one of the largest net zero energy commercial leased buildings in the state, if not the country. And I think a lot of landlords and tenants alike would really point to leased buildings and the particular contractual challenges as a major barrier for just not even thinking about or starting to pursue net zero energy in commercial lease spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say to a developer to really open their mind and get them interested in taking the first step in pursuing, and when do you think that conversation should be had?
Well, earlier is always better when they're initially starting the development, putting together their pro forma. But I think, it's also getting the developer's head around this as a competitive advantage. So this, for instance, this is 100,000, Boulder Commons is 100,000 square feet. And our developer he set the goal of net zero energy early on, and so the whole project was geared towards this mantra, and he did it for a competitive advantage in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Net zero energy buildings, and there's not that many out there yet, but they have shown to provide strong returns to developers, especially over time. There's a 17% sales premium for a green building if you're a developer that just builds and turns it over. But there's also a 9% increase in value in operating income. And so I think having that, having an increase in operating income is obviously a key driver for any developer. But I think also having tenants that believe in this opportunity, that and increasing tenant retention, that's going to really help our developer in kind of downturn markets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And one question I have is, good information and motivation and case studies. I think, as we have more and more leaders and more demonstrable examples that net zero energy makes sense and makes money in the commercial lease space, better information doesn't always inspire action. What types of recommendations would you give to your peers in the development industry about what steps should they take from the get-go? What should they think about? What should they do to get started on this path to zero if it's something that hasn't been on their mind so far?
Well, I think, our work with the Rocky Mountain Institute recently on the net zero leasing piece, I think there are some really great examples that are paving the way that from a pure leasing perspective, and something that can be used as a tool, are a great example in how a net zero lease could be implemented, right?
Yep.
And utilize the information that's out there. It's there. There are examples, there are real life examples and, you know, Boulder Commons being one of them, but from a multi-tenant perspective, and it's a great tool to start with.
Yeah, and yeah, hands down, like, you know, it does require more thought getting to net zero energy, and especially in a multi-tenant building where you have the complexity of the split incentive and lease structures and tenants. But there are ways that you can overcome that, even over time. You know, we recognize that leases all don't turn over at the same point in time, and, you know, we can't get everything just exactly how we want it tomorrow. But I think, you know, like Blair was alluding to, it's a process, you know, and this, putting your portfolio or your buildings on a path to net zero energy is another piece of work that we're collaborating on right now, in looking at, you know, what do you need to do first? What steps need to be in place? I mean, I think the CPACE, you know, the upgrades that it enabled in your portfolio are great, and I think, how can we build that? And as leases turn over, what terms and what conditions do we want to get in, so that it's a process over time that will ultimately yield a net zero energy portfolio?
Imagine, you know, I drive at night oftentimes on our campus, and I see the whole, you know, entire building still lit up when employees aren't there. And then our tenant, you know, facility managers complain, why are operating costs so high? And then you point this out to them. So it's a behavioral change on start thinking in terms of, so imagine if you were rewarded in your operating costs if you actually saved energy. So, you know, setting that bar, I think, that's where the experimentation comes in. But once that bar is set and then it works for everybody, if you actually are rewarded for saving, you know, energy, and that and how that gets all your employees to be engaged, and that's where the culture really starts shifting. Right? Yeah.
I really like this idea of the process you've gone through, and obviously you've been moving down this road for quite some time. Maybe talk a little bit about the lessons that you've learned, both the positive, this is a big win that I'd love to share with the industry, versus, wow, we really did a misstep on this one, and I definitely learned from my mistakes. What are some of the key learnings that you'd like to share?
So Cara alluded to it in the beginning, but we started down a project called Fiddler's View, and it was really cool little building on our property, and we went down the pathway, but we had it already designed. And then we said, oh, what about geothermal? What about, and so we started adding on, you know, all of these elements after, and it ended up making the project cost prohibitive. So learning point is, I know our team. I know the architect with whom we'd work, and the contractor, and the, you know, Rocky Mountain Institute, and is starting with the team from the beginning, clearly communicating the vision, and then you start the design, and then you start which is, you know, instrumental in the process. So that was a key learning point for us. And then, you know, we build and maintain really strong relationships with our tenants. And so I'll talk about a success, but working with them closely on, you know, hey, your lights are on all night. And you actually start seeing, I've started to see them more conscious and turning off the lights, and then them seeing communicating back to them and seeing it reflected in their operating savings. And small steps, small items, and it'll be even greater to see when we do this whole retrofit with the CPACE program at the end of this year, really truly be able to exhibit cost savings, etc. So, and people care. People really do. And which is exciting to me. People want to talk about it, right?
You talk about these maybe small, minute changes on one level, but when you're looking about those changes over an entire portfolio or a very large commercial building, they really do add up. And I think back to in the Net Zero Leasing Guide, a single line that says, net zero energy dash, when properly executed, can have all these benefits. So, you know, to your point, Cara, what would you recommend in terms of lessons learned about what it really takes to properly execute net zero at this scale?
I think one thing that has kind of caught me off guard a little bit was our landlord, and we spend a lot of time together, but he was talking about how he pitches this building to prospective tenants. And he doesn't start out with this is a net zero energy building, because a lot of tenants, they don't understand. He starts with what matters to them. This building is a comfortable building. It'll make your people happy and more productive, and kind of the story evolves from there. And this approach of, building first off a fundamentally, good building that, by the way, is net zero energy is interesting. And I've seen it, in putting together this guide. We interviewed a lot of the folks who have done, net zero energy buildings, and we spoke actually with a woman who is in a net zero building who owns a hair salon, and her life is about cutting hair, but she could tell you all about, how she's transforming her hair dryers, and she's, changing the way she called them the lady cookers, affectionately, but like the heat lamps, and she just, the awareness that she had in an area that's not her core focus, it really touched me. I mean, I think people care.
That's great.
Like
And so we have a property management team. We don't have a property manager, but one of our members is the director of concierge, and having him be this concierge of knowledge and having our tenants be able to, open the conversation to things like this, I think is more important. So it's not about the net zero, it's about the deeper, more psychological components to it, right? The human connection. Yeah.
Which is important, right? Because I think the statistic is we spend 90% of our lives in buildings, and it really does make a big difference. Well, we're going to take a few questions from our audience here. One that came in asks, how far away is the tipping point for the adoption of net zero energy commercial lease buildings?
Oh, that's a good question. I think in different markets it'll come sooner, and I think even in Boulder, where it is a more educated, in Denver, like this is a very, it's a very active market right now, and so I think this is the first net zero energy here in Boulder, energy building here in Boulder that's leased, and so part of our efforts go back to in moving this tipping point closer is getting the word out more, and so RMI received a grant from the city of Boulder to share some of these findings and to get the outreach behind, the knowledge behind this research out and show the value for developers and show the value to tenants. So we're engaging on a local front, to share some of those findings.
But like we keep saying, it's a marathon, right?
Yeah.
So it's a process, but the conversations are happening. Economic development partnerships all over the state. They're getting involved. They're attracting tenants this way. It's happening.
Yeah.
And I would actually point to a recent paper published by our partners at New Buildings Institute, and they every 2 years publish sort of a status of the net zero industry, and they their recent piece just which came out at the end of February showed a 700% increase in the number of net zero certified and emerging projects since 2012. So there's indeed a massive market growth, but when we think of, what are there, 4 billion square feet of just office alone in the U.S., so there's still a long way to go, but it's very positive to see that we're at least moving in the right direction.
That's great.
So the next question that came in is, do you feel like bringing your buildings to net zero energy increases or reduces your risk as a landlord?
Risk from what perspective? I'm curious.
There are probably several perspectives. I would argue that it reduces your risk because, from a landlord's biggest risk is vacancy, right? That's their biggest cost. And so if you have tenants that are more engaged in the ethos of the building and have, happier, healthier, comfortable occupants, then you're going to have less of that vacancy risk. I think there is, there can be an incremental capital cost to get to net zero energy, so there's more risk to manage that well, so that, there's not cost overruns initially.
We're talking long-term, though, and long-term relationships. And so I would say reduces our risk, especially if the conversations are happening now. Even when, 5 years ago when Fidelity first moved into our buildings, and the conversations that's why they're in our building is, these initial starts to net zero, are required, are happening, et cetera. And I believe that will actually keep them there even longer term, even out, I believe they'll renew with us. But I can see why it would increase your risk, because we are taking risks. We are, pioneers in what we're doing. It's not easy, but telling the story, not just the net zero story, but the story of what's behind all of that, right?
I think what's very powerful in what you've done and what RMI has done in this lease guide is, this, with even some of these pioneering examples that are maybe taking on a little bit of extra risk by moving first, the fact that you're able to share key lessons learned, share actually to the level of the redacted contractual agreements that got us where we are today. We'll just, I think, share those learnings and reduce the risk for others moving forward. So I guess thank you. Thank you for doing that. One other question that came in from our audience is, you mentioned Fidelity as one tenant who demanded that a building was to a certain performance level. How do you feel other tenants are demanding? Are they really asking for high-performance buildings? Are they requesting more LEED space? Are they really starting to ask for net zero energy?
LEED, which is a step towards net zero. It doesn't even hit the curve yet, but it's on the way, right? So, to start, certainly not.
If we think about, the tipping point question, think of 10 years ago. Were tenants even asking for LEED? Was that on their radar yet? I think
no, but Palazzo Verde 10 years ago, we developed LEED Gold before LEED was even popular.
Yeah.
And now it's, everybody talks LEED, right?
Yeah. So hopefully net zero energy buildings are on that same curve.
Great, and Colorado's sort of in this really great space to lead, right, between the Boulder Energy Challenge, between all of the work that you're doing on the ground, and so it's kind of this sweet spot in this really great place where we're, there's almost a microscope on Colorado and how we're going to move the market. And California is obviously with Title 24 and all of the work that they're doing from a codes and standards perspective, but it's really exciting to see Colorado emerge as this leader as well.
Right. There are a lot of buildings going up. Not all of them are thinking in terms of net zero.
Yeah.
Probably maybe 10%, right? But with the new Green Roof Initiative and things are being forced, people are being forced to look at the issue, which isn't comfortable, but those uncomfortable conversations are what force change. And we're having them, right?
Yeah. And just one closing question. What can we expect next? And we'll start with you, Blair, in your path, in your long path toward net zero energy.
So I think in order to really make this effective and happen is collaboration. And one of our next, that Rocky Mountain Institute and John Madden Company are working on is creating net zero districts and getting the developers in our area and in the southeast market on board and a part of this and creating a collective. So that's what's next for me and for Rocky Mountain Institute in our area.
Great. Cara, anything to add?
I think also in April, mid-April, there's the Getting to Zero Forum in Pittsburgh, and that's going to bring together the leading edge thoughts across the country and around the world on net zero energy penetration and value and financing, and so that'll be a conference in Pittsburgh, a couple of days, and some tours and some great events surrounding it. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, me too. Definitely. Yeah, so if you really want to ask our panelists another question in person, join us at the Getting to Zero Forum, April 17th through 19th in Pittsburgh, and it really is a great event. We hold it every 2 years, and it's this great representation from developers, from tenants, from designers, from electric utilities, and really looking at what's that grid edge component of net zero energy. So how do we continue to push the boundaries of what's possible and have a lot of great dynamic discussions. So Wonderful. Well, I thank both of you so much for joining us today on Ask RMI. Thank you. And thanks to all of you as well. We really appreciate your questions, and thank you for engaging with us. And it's all of you who makes our work possible. So don't hesitate to visit our website at rmi.org to learn more about what we're doing in the building sector and beyond. And we look forward to following up with a future broadcast. So have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.